So I've been intending to bring some paintings up here and talk to you about specific techniques that I used. I don't like to do this early on in the semester. I want you to get a running head start on developing your own style. I do not want to communicate to you that this is a style you should be working in. It may be that a few of you have a style that is a lot like mine, and that's fine. Doesn't have, and it may be, but it may not be. So don't be influenced necessarily by my style. These are some techniques I want you to be familiar with. So the question was just asked, how do you get soft highlights of a light color in a dark field? I have another painting at home that I did. I think it's at home. Don't remember where it is in my office, of our dog when he was a pup, and the background on it has some really good examples, I think, of what I want to show you, but this will suffice. So a little bit of background information on this painting. First of all, what I want to talk about specifically to answer the question that was asked has to do with some highlights down here and some highlights over here, not with most of the painting. And then I've got a couple of other examples of this lifting out, and that's what I want to talk to you about. So the background on this painting, this was my first painting. This is in 1996. I started doing watercolor in about 1969, 1970. So I've been working with watercolor for quite a while, always on cold press paper. So I was very accustomed to cold press paper. So I decided, I needed to do this on hot press paper, which was really a dumb choice, not having worked on hot press paper for a long time, if at all, at that point. I'd done a 30 by 40 inch painting of the White County Courthouse on hot press watercolor board, which works similar to this watercolor paper. So I spent quite a bit of time with Misket on this. I did a drawing. By the way, the inspiration for this was the cast shadow. Got home one evening, the light coming in a west window, casting this really striking shadow, dark light pattern on the wall behind the plant. Well, no watercolorist paints fast enough to grab that, so I grabbed my camera, which I do whenever I see something that has potential as a photograph or as a painting. I grab my camera. So I took a photograph. I don't know what the time frame difference was from when I took the photograph to when I decided to do the painting, but there was a year or two probably. So I used Misket to protect all of the plant leaves, the outside of the vase, the top edge, the perimeter of the table, and all the white on the wall in the background. A lot of Misket. So there's quite a bit of time invested in drawing the thing, getting the drawing right, and in applying the Misket, waiting for the Misket to dry, and now I'm ready to paint this flat background. And the flat background, that wall color, in my mind, had to be absolutely flat. No brushwork, no glazing, just flat tone. Piece of cake on cold press paper. On hot press paper, it's another story. And I didn't know that until I'd already invested a lot of time in the drawing. I started painting and I immediately knew I had a problem because my brushstroke lines were showing up on the paper. And I had to figure out how to get them to not show up, and I had seconds to do it. And I was able to get it figured out pretty enough. I needed to keep it flooded with water. I didn't need to keep brushing it. And I worked it quickly, and I was able to do what I wanted to do everywhere, but right down here. When you look at this later, you're going to see that it has kind of a mottled look. I just couldn't get the brush strokes to quit showing up, but I knew I had to stop before it got worse, not better. So that's the background on this. It's a pretty tight painting. Actually, there's a lot of pretty loose work on the leaves themselves, but the rest of the painting is pretty tight. I had attempted to do the doily with the photograph that I had taken, and I almost ruined the the pattern of the doily right away because I didn't have enough visual information in my photograph. So I ran and got the doily, and so I could really see it, and I was able to figure out how to paint the dark pattern to make that doily feel right. So the rest of it is pretty straightforward. It's just a bunch of flat washes and graded washes, kind of like a glorified paint by number. But I wanted these highlights down here on this little scroll work. By the way, the scroll work on the front of the table, it was a really nice little classical bit of scroll work, and so I ended up incorporating that in the frame by buying I bought a rosette and cut it apart on a jigsaw and bought these motifs, so I mimicked that in the frame. A little kitschy, but I kind of liked it on this because it draws attention to that little area on this photograph. So I have these highlights in here, and I have some highlights over here, some highlights over here. There's a soft highlight, and these darker blue highlights over here. All of those highlights and some of the other highlights up in here, but all of those highlights are lifting the watercolor off of the paper. That's where the hot press paper is really nice, because I could not have done this effectively on cold press paper. So it was a happy accident, really. I didn't realize how you could lift the color off of a hot press paper a lot easier than you can a cold press paper. It has to do with the tightness of the paper itself and whether the pigment is soaking in or laying on the surface, I guess. So, and there are a few highlights that I left the white of the paper over in here. There is no white paint on this whatsoever, so any highlights are the white of the paper or what's the white of the paper. But in some cases, the white is just left, and some places, or like in the white background in the doily, in other places it's lifted out. Nowhere on this did I scratch the highlights out, and I could have scratched them out. If I had a really fine ink eraser, I might have been able to have lifted these soft highlights out, but that would have been a little difficult. But with a small brush, I simply moistened and blotted to lift the highlight back out. And when I reference lifting the highlights out on my critiques of your paintings, this is what I'm talking about. Like this painting right here, in that critique. Okay? I talked about possibly lifting some highlights out over here, possibly lifting some out on the edges of this white. So there are a lot of places where this really works. So these white highlights are lifted off the surface by moistening and blotting, rubbing maybe gently, but if you rub it, you're going to move the water laterally, and you're only going to lift where it's moist. You can blot this dry watercolor all day and it's not going to go anywhere. It'll stay there, but if it's moist, you blot it and it's going to come off. So those highlights are done this way, but the real reason for bringing this up here was to show you this over here. There's a deep blue, there's a blue highlight going on over here on the rim, on this shaded side. The light's coming in from over here. This is in the shadow, and so these highlights needed to be cool highlights. And so I put down a blue glaze on this side, let it dry completely, and then I put down a dark brownish blue, really dark. I mean, this is close to value 2 in here. Dark glaze, let it dry, and then I lifted the top glaze off, the same way that I lifted the highlights off here. A little bit of water and blotting, a little bit of water and blotting, and I got these soft blue highlights over here on this side. It works really well. So, in talking about that lifting out highlights, went ahead and brought, I think it would be a really nice challenge to do a large painting, well, not too large. When I tell you what I'm talking about, you'll know why I'm saying not too large, but do a painting with a variety of colors underneath, and then layer over the top of it some really dark, and then pull the whole image out by lifting. everything. So you get these, that would be cool. It reminds me of an artist actually the White County Arts Council invited an artist from southern Missouri to do a workshop here in Searcy years ago. This would have been the early 1980s. I took the workshop just out of curiosity, ended up doing my own painting during the workshop, and he gave me some really good advice when I was doing that painting. But we had him here, and he talked to the watercolor class. By the way, he was a professional musician. I think he was a trombone player. But he was a professional musician that was just tired of trying to make money as a professional musician. And he was good at painting, so he took up watercolor, and he was very successful marketing his watercolor paintings. He had a little quarter sheet painting of Indian corn, you know, the deep reds and purples Indian corn. Gorgeously rendered. Those little kernels of corn were popping off of the surface. I asked him how he did it. He did it exactly the same way I did on that other one. Did these highlights where I lifted off the paint. So he painted the entire cob of corn dark, rich, reds, red blues, red purples, and then he lifted off the highlights so those kernels were three-dimensional and pop. Okay, so there's just a little bit of what I'm talking about on this painting. I have this bird's eye view of these two boats in the water. This is up in Maine at Camden, I think. I forget which town it was. But this photograph of these boats down below me, when I'm looking down at them, really struck me. So I did this painting, and over here I wanted this post which is reflected in the water, going down into the water with some carbuncles or something growing under the water. You can barely see them. And so I needed that to be dark, and I handled these exactly the same way that I handled that. What did I do with it? Oh, the dark blue highlights over here on the painting with the table. So these are lifted out. There's this post is lifted out and these little highlights. But one other thing I wanted to show you on this one, my entire signature line on this is lifted out with a small paintbrush. Water on the letter J and blot. Water and blot. Water and blot. It's a tedious process, but I liked it a lot better than if I had scratched it in. To me, that was just too harsh. But anyway, you can do a lot with that lifting out. This, by the way, is on cold press paper, and it still works. Anyway, another application of that lifting out. One more example of lifting out. And again, most of this is not lifting out, but there's some highlights on these geraniums sitting in the window. Those are lifted out, and these highlights, they're deep in that room. There's something going on. There's some light and shadow. It's obscure. I needed it to be soft, and those are all lifted out. And so I'll leave these in here so you can look at them. But a number of places where highlights are lifted back out by moistening and then blotting. So, any quick questions? That making sense? I think for now that's all I wanted to talk about on these, and primarily it was the lifting out, but I got to throw in a little bit about hot press paper.